The casual observer might never be able to notice, but somewhere out here lies the border between Mexico and the United States of America. Each year, uncounted thousands of people will make their way across this treacherous terrain and into the U.S., often at great expense and at great risk. Most will be successful. Some will be caught by law enforcement and sent back. And every year, hundreds will die in the attempt. The sign says, "Don't expose your life to the elements. It isn't worth it." But for millions of illegal immigrants, or would-be immigrants, it is. In 2007, 218 bodies of migrants were found in Pima County, Arizona alone. The past year of 2010 may have set a record in the number of border crossing deaths. Such statistics are reason enough to consider immigration as a human rights issue. More broadly, the question has to be asked as to what kind of system is in place that motivates individuals to take such tremendous risks. Freedom of movement as a human right is not a new concept. Article 13 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, says this: "Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country." What's missing here? Any responsibilities for those countries which receive foreign citizens, whether as travelers or migrants. In fact, freedom of movement is somewhat unique in the field of human liberties in that, legally at least, it has actually gone down globally over time. Even as globalization has deepened the economic and social connection across borders, governments have thrown up more roadblocks to actually crossing those borders.
One of the unfortunate reality of international politics is people often think of people who look like them, people who speak like them, people who come from the country that they're from, they're human, and somehow people who don't look like them, people who sound funny, people who come from the other side of an imaginary line, they're somehow less human and they somehow have fewer rights.
There are countries out there that continue to be very resistant to migration. Japan is a great example of this. This is a country that is the most aged state on the world. They need specific skilled migrants. They need nurses in particular to really care for people in old age, but they are not at all willing to allow any sort of immigration. And we haven't seen any signs of change in the Japanese policy towards immigration.
Europe is a particularly interesting case, where the freedom of movement that exists between the borders of the member states of the European Union helps to make the continent a magnet for immigrants from elsewhere.
The problem is that in most European countries, population aging is so advanced and so serious an issue that it would take an unbelievable number of migrants in order to keep the system steady. And that's not really politically feasible.
Back in the United States, a nation historically much more open to immigration, laws like Arizona's SB 1070 have stoked controversy by attempting to crack down harshly on unauthorized migration.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different reasons why people don't really like immigrants, why they don't want immigrants around, or why they object to immigrants. The big ones are they took our jobs, or they're going to come here and they're going to take our jobs.
They took our job! They took our job! They took our job! They took our job!
Another common complaint is the drain on social services created by immigrants who supposedly draw more in benefits than they pay in taxes.
Is even if immigrants are a net burden on the welfare state, it's going to be very, very costly to prevent them from coming into the country in the first place.
Indeed, the United States spent nearly $6 billion on immigration enforcement last year and deported nearly 1 million people. The fact that undocumented migration continues despite these efforts owes much to the overwhelming economic logic underlying most migration, especially to rich countries.
Migration is a way to distribute efficiently needed skill sets. So for a lot of developing countries, they might have, some of them might have an excess of young men, for example, who really need to find jobs, but there's not really the capacity to provide those jobs at home. But there may be economic opportunities abroad.
Because immigrants earn higher wages, sometimes by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10, by moving from a poor country to a rich country. And people in rich countries get cheaper stuff and more opportunities. Everybody's better off. Everybody wins as a result of cross-border immigration. Unfortunately, this is politically unpopular.
Of course, not all migrants leave their countries of origin for economic reasons. some are refugees, unable to return to their homes because of fear of violence or persecution. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights does name a right to seek asylum, but in practice the current process of obtaining refugee status is often arduous. The Refugee Empowerment Program in Memphis helps those refugees who have made it to the United States to adjust to life in a new country. Many of the migrants come from some of the most chaotic and dangerous places on earth.
You have to provide for your family. You have to get yourself a job. You have to work hard. You have to pay a rent. You never pay a rent in your life. You never had to provide for family because people always just give things to you. So that's very, very devastating for some people because they don't know how to start. Because some people have lived and they were born, and the children were born in refugee camps and they lived there for more than 30 years. So that's very.
Under the current system of border controls, then, even those individuals with a recognized right to move from their home countries can end up in a sort of stateless limbo for decades at a time. As with restrictions against conventional economic migrants, there are clearly victims when the freedom of movement is abridged.
Essentially, what immigration restrictions are is a morally questionable claim that people who are born on one side of an imaginary line drawn by politicians are in some sense of a different moral and social character than people who are born on the other side of that magic line.
Some might argue that states have a duty to their own residents that supersedes that to foreigners. But even if this is granted, it does not follow that the alleged costs of migration for the host country are greater than the moral interest in allowing for the freedom and welfare of migrants, to say nothing of the material benefits for both their home countries and the receiving countries. Furthermore, restrictions on freedom of movement interfere not only with the rights of migrants, but with anyone in a country who might want to interact with them, socially or commercially.
Obviously, I shouldn't be allowed to tell you who you can marry. I don't see any reason why I should be allowed to tell you who you can hire or who you can work for.
From a global perspective, perhaps the key question is what a system of border controls means for a just international order. The philosopher John Rawls argued that a just society would attempt to maximize the position of the lowest of its members. In this vein, suppose that you had a chance to decide what kind of freedom of movement would be allowed on the global scale, but behind Rawls' famous veil of ignorance, you didn't know who you would be in the world. You might be a Bolivian coca farmer, a South African cattle herd, or a New Jersey accountant. If you had no idea what your place in global society would be, it would make sense to adopt policies that would give you the best chance at improving your lot in life, no matter what impoverished or marginalized state you may be born into. And what would the best way to do that be?
Among people who study development economics, that open border immigration will do more to increase the wealth of the world's poor than just about any other possible intervention.
This is why freedom of movement is not merely an issue of economic or social policy, but an issue of human rights. Obviously, decades of restrictionist policies are not going to change overnight. Scare tactics are far too prevalent in debates over migration, both in this country and elsewhere. But the best way to combat them is to take an honest look at the true costs and benefits of open migration, and the crucial role it can play in promoting a more prosperous and equitable planet. And of course, it pays to listen to the migrants themselves.
We came here because we want our children to have an education and so they can get a better life. They understand what it is.